Hello and welcome to Varn Blog and Regrettable Century -2. So we have the brothers Regrettable with us, Regrettable Chris and Regrettable Jason.
The outreach department of the Regrettable Century.
Yeah, that's right. And the HR department.
Yeah. We were going to call you the diplomat and managerial core.
Perfect. I accept.
The professional managerial core, if you will.
Yeah. I was going to call you the DMC, which is but anyway, we are starting a new series. This is not part of the No Royal Road series, though, because
Part of the Some Royal Road series.
This is more like the Royal Road has decayed and gotten all wonky, and half of it's gone because it wasn't good Roman roads, and basically whatever happened to the Roman Empire in the 6th century is what's happening now, but not really, and that's what we're going to get to today. Capitalist decadence is different than Roman decadence, as comes up a couple of places in a couple of different of these articles that we're going to be discussing.
This is no funding for public infrastructure as opposed to no Royal Road.
Yeah.
Well, one major difference between the collapse of the Roman Empire and the collapse of the decadence of this moment in all of the world is that there's no Catholic Church to hold together any of the traditions.
No bishops to rally retainers around to act as feudal lords.
Right.
Oh man. So,
and on that note, we're done.
Are you wearing a Deaf of the West t-shirt?
Yeah, I thought it was appropriate for today.
I'm wearing a Deaf working from home t-shirt, so
it's the same thing, you know.
Kind of.
I'm wearing a Vulcan, Vulcan stone shirt, and I guess in a sense, it's kind of the same thing.
How?
So, the title of this series is From Dawn to Decadence, and it's named after the somewhat infamous 1990s Jacques Barzon book.
Right.
We're not actually discussing, but it is kind of on my mind.
I was looking over that today. Like I hadn't heard of it until recently, and I was kind of like perusing its. Oh, there's a baby yelling in the other room. Let me go close the door. Sorry. But anyway, I was kind of perusing the premise of the book and just to see what it was about, and it looks like it might be worth reading.
Yeah, it's not a Marxist text at all, but it is interesting. Barzun, for example, in a different book on academia, called that the reliance on graduate student labor was going to lead to a crisis in education eventually by overproducing elites, and also by creating a highly exploitative system which ended the democratic spirit of the tenure system by making tenure more exclusive and making it dependent upon backbreaking work by adjuncts. And he predicted that in like the late 60s.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
He was correct.
So Barzun is an interesting man, if a conservative one. One of the last great old liberals. So I'm naming this in his honor, and also maybe we should talk about that book. I love that book. I read that book when I was in college. I had it by my bed for a long time when I was a good conservative.
I just checked out the audiobook.
But we need to talk about a couple of different theories when we talk about From Dawn to Decadence, because as I will say that while I've never believed in moral decadence, because I don't have a moral, I don't have a divinely sanctioned set of virtues that I think are ubiquitously socially shared. I have never lived in the world where that was the case anyway. I will say that I have believed in social and economic decadence my entire life. At no time have I been an optimist. And in fact, some of my old conservative friends, when I became a left-winger, used to say to me, we don't understand why you are. You're not. You believe too much in the tragic cycles of history. How can you believe in progressivism? And my defense was, leftism is not inherently progressivistic.
Right.
It does believe in certain kinds of progress. But the idea that technological progress equates to moral progress is Whiggish history. When people try to make Marxist unequivocally Whiggish, I always feel like they're doing a disservice to Marxism, but it is very common in two ways, both in which Marxists are seen as common cause with Whiggish liberals and progressives, but also in the productive forces arguments, which seems to argue unilaterally that centralization and production can go on forever.
Which is just kind of the way most American leftists see the world at this point.
Right.
It's like the Steven Pinker version of Marxism.
That's like the most depressing sentence anyone has ever said.
Well, I mean, and now that everyone's moved away from gay space luxury communism, now they believe it for like getting rid of, once you like, I don't know, mass deport 98% of the population, including all of themselves, to unnamed and unspecified other places, that you will somehow, reach. I don't know. I actually can't understand, because actually I think you're right, but I also think there's an anti-enlightenment streak in the current left too that is even more pernicious, because it not that we should defend everything about the Enlightenment. I think we should have a dialectic about it. It's a mixed bag thing, right? I mean, like,
right.
Nor is it just European, and I actually think it's weirdly. It kind of weirdly takes the French and English, philosophers and philosophers at their word that it's just a white man's game, to say that it is. Like it requires, Islamic contributions to early modern culture. It requires technologies being reappropriated from India, China, and the Middle East. It requires, thinking and stuff from all. The Ottoman Empire is a big contributor to the beginnings of the Enlightenment, as is trade reopening with China. I think these are things that, and people inverting the kind of bombastic Eurocentric claims of the Enlightenment, they ignore. But all that aside, that's not what we're here to talk about today. This is not Varn says, hey, the Enlightenment isn't all bad. You don't have to just invert Steven Pinker's idiocy. There is a way in which everyone thinks that things are just going to continue to get better. And it's even implied in stuff like, I've been thinking a lot about the BFO comment that was made infamous or famous by Mark Fisher, that, the slow cancellation of the future. And the hauntology of the now. And in one sense, I was like, well, that misrecognizes the problem, right? The problem is not that the future has been canceled. That makes it sound like you had a future in the first place. Like that this was infinitely growable, and you're just mad that it's not anymore. And if like the communists can seize it, they can start it over again. And
like I feel like with Fisher's perspective, I embrace it fully, but only on this one condition, that it was already true before he recognized it.
Sure. I think that when I think of the slow cancellation of the future, I think of like it like a literal canceling, like, oh crap, well, it turns out that we were never going to be able to do any of this stuff anyway, so we might as well just go ahead and cancel any expectations of it.
Yeah, it's a cultural cancellation.
Yeah,
it's a recognition of reality. It's not like, oh, we shouldn't do that anymore. It's really more like we shouldn't think that we can do that anymore.
Yeah. Well, I think that the problem is we've also changed the language. So even when Fisher said it, canceling meant both actively being canceled as if being canceled by a force, which is true, instead of, oh, shock of recognition hey, this show isn't going so well, let's just call it quits before we sink any more money into it.
Right.
Right. Like the network is just not allowing you to do anything, and it's going to go into reruns now.
But I think in another sense, decadence has two implications. Because the other thing about decadence is that if something starts to grow in the muck, the muck is actually nutriently useful for something else.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah.
But you can't see that if you're the fruit that's rotting into soil. So the decadent image is actually interesting to me because the implication actually is, and it is even in conservative decadence theorists, and we're going to talk about some of them first, is that new things, in Spengler's case, it would be new civilizations, emerge with the death of something else, like flies emerging from a corpse, but then being eaten by birds that go off and live a full life and go do their own thing, and they have their own cycle.
Right.
In Marxism, decadence theories get a little confused because a lot of people have trouble telling them apart from breakdown and crisis theories, which are not exactly the same thing, and we'll have to get to that too. And I think today,
I will even say that
Mm-hmm.
I'm even in recent years, I was even a person who would say they were the same thing. Like we did an episode about this like 3 years ago. I went back and listened to it, and I basically contended, I think incorrectly, that they're basically the same thing, and they're not. I don't think anymore.
Yeah, I was in that episode too, and that's not one of our best, because I think that we misunderstood a lot of what we were reading. Or actually, we kind of took at face value some of what we were reading, and we shouldn't have.
I think
that's
right.
what it was. Yeah.
Yeah. So did you read the same articles then?
Some of them, not all of them. Like the Aufhebung article, we read those, the ones from LibCon.
Mm-hmm.
And those,
and the Samir Amin one too.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's right.
Because I remember Kevin really liked it.
Yeah, he did. He would.
I mean, I kind of did, but we'll get into that later. But I wouldn't reject it entirely.
I wouldn't reject it entirely, but I think we have to be honest about how much that particular sub-school of world systems theory is using Marx as just a justification for having a discussion of modes of production, but that it basically believes there's a transhistorical mode of production, and it is the Asiatic mode of production, which is renamed a tributary mode to remove all the racial connotations.
Yeah.
I actually think that what Amin does there is like he takes an idea which is useful and even it's at least interesting and worth contending with, and he blows it out of proportion and makes it something to reject entirely.
Yeah, well, so we'll come back to that. We'll discuss that one in detail, but I do think we need to get these definitions down. In general, decadence theories are a theory that any given entity has a natural life cycle.
Right.
That the best analogy for a social entity, and I'm using vague terms because this does not just apply to Marxism, so people who wonder why I'm using non-Marxist language here is because I'm trying to get a grok of a decadence theory before we get into the Marxist specific varieties. That any social entity in totality is a totality, for one thing. That even though it is not a totality in the sense of being monolithic, because an organism is not monolithic. An organism, you have organs, you have cells, you have things within you dying and living, so it is not, but it is that the best analogy for a social unit is an organic, aka a living being.
Right.
And living beings have life cycles.
Well, yeah, and like despite the fact that some stuff is living and some stuff is not, at a certain point, that quantity becomes it makes a qualitative difference, and then enough things dying means death overall.
Yeah,
Despite the fact that certain things are not dying.
Even though you lose all your cells every 7 years, if your organs start to fail, you're going to die.
Right. And similarly, after you die, your hair keeps growing.
Yeah, and some of your cell tissue might still be kind of living.
Yeah. At least for a while.
Yeah. So that is the basis of decadence theory. Decadence theory is probably, if we're quite honest, one of the oldest social theories.
Mm-hmm.
You see it in Plato and Polybius. You see it in Ibn Khaldun. You see it in Aristotle. That there are natural phases of the polis, that you go through these phases because of what we would in modern parlance call path dependencies. The way that Plato and Aristotle talk about it is tyrannies emerge from republics, which lead to rebellions into democracies, but democracies decay into oligarchies, or because democracy had a more negative connotation in the ancient world, democracies or republics decay into democracies, which they meant as rule of the demos, which is just rule of the mob. And tyrannies emerge in response to that, and thus the cycle continues. And for people who thought this is just some kind of Platonic norm, because they also had, if you go back into Hesiod and whatnot, you had your Golden Age, Silver Age stuff. And you had your Lapsarianism. You see this all over the ancient Near East and in early modern Europe. But it's not just there. If you look in Indo-European myths in general, you see Kali Yuga cycles, and
or just in Christianity, there is the end times cycle, right?
Yeah, the thing that makes Christianity different is there's no starting over, or once things are started over, it doesn't restart the cycle. It's a static cycle after that point.
Right.
But it's a very common cycle in the early modern period. And I'm using that word advisedly because it includes both the Renaissance and early modernity, whatever the fuck that means. And Chris, as a historian, you know how hard those things are to pin down.
Right, you basically just have to come up with a hard line and stick to it, regardless of how artificial it is.
It's the Jumpy Revolt.
Yeah,
that's when modernity begins, and what's that? The 12th century?
Yeah,
the 13th century.
That's the early part of early modern history. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually
it's actually the Protestant Reformation. That's what I would actually say.
I tend to think the religious wars are what begins early modern history.
Yeah,
and I just put it before the bourgeois revolutions, and I guess I'm the. You and I agree, us agree with that, but I think the rest of the Marxist world is like, no, it starts with France or maybe the English Civil War.
Okay, so Choppy Revolt was
the latest. Sorry, go ahead.
Choppy Revolt was 1378. I would put that as a little bit too early. I would call that
it's probably too early.
Pre-modern in the sense that it's about to be modern, but I would say by 1500 you're in early modernity.
So, because what it actually is. It's the discovery of the New World, because by that point, that's when the processes which you would equate with modernity all begin as a result of Columbus landing on whatever
Hispaniola.
Is it Hispaniola?
I think that's the first one that he landed on.
I actually my timing is the late 14th century or late 15th century for these reasons too. The fall of the Byzantine Empire and the end of Rome.
That's definitely one.
The beginning of the idea of Europeanness. Europeanness is not an idea that's really broadly adopted until Byzantine falls and you don't have a Rome anymore.
Europeanness replaces Christendom.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Right. The beginning of the transatlantic trade, moving from the Mediterranean trade system into the transatlantic system, and the competition between absolutist and Republican theories of governments, because the multiple estates that had polycentric emergence is in the end from the late antique into the Middle Ages, whatever. All that is ending, and you start having consolidated nation states, because it's really hard to talk about nation states before the 15th century. Like,
yeah, it really is impossible.
Really,
right.
and you got the advent of pike and shot warfare. By that point, you're clearly in the in the modern period.
You have the democratization of warfare.
Yeah, exactly.
So it is. You don't need like massive amounts of serfs to maintain a knight who has to train all the time to be able to use his war materials. Like there's so many things converging at once. And that's if you look in Europe. Now, if you're not looking in Europe, I don't know, it's harder. Then you could go a little earlier. But
I think for simplicity's sake, I would say the 1500s, that whole century, is the transition into what's called modernity.
Right. And by the way, I'm just going to say it's Eurocentric.
Well, yeah.
It is necessarily Eurocentric.
Europe is about to unleash itself upon the world.
Right.
And forever alter literally every aspect of life for the entire planet. So I think when you're talking about modernity being Eurocentric is okay, because we're talking about processes of epoch shifting processes, right?
Right.
Well, right.
It's fair.
And this is why when everybody wants to undo settler colonialism, they basically freeze the picture at about 1401. And fine, I get it, right? So I think that's a fair statement. By this time, okay, it is clear to the people living at the end of the 15th century and 16th century, once the Florentine republics have failed and blah, 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 you actually start getting a return back to these classical theories of cycles. Mm-hmm. So Polybius starts being read again. People start reading Ibn Khaldun, which is the Islamic version of that. And you have something that we might call today like proto-sociology or proto-anthropology. And you get it, and it gets manifested a little later in people like Giambattista Vico, right? Mm-hmm. Who tries to work out a series of cycles in civilization and barbarism and this, that, and the other. So, so Giambattista Vico is probably where it starts in Europe. Is when you get modern decadence theory. But this gives us to, I think, the two biggest proponents that are kind of known in our world, which is Spengler and Toynbee.
Right. So, and Spengler is heavily influenced by Nietzsche's ideas of decadence as well. So you cover both by dealing with Spengler, for those of you who are going to say, yeah, but what about Nietzsche?
Well, yeah, right. And Nietzsche doesn't systematize it, because Nietzsche doesn't systematize anything.
No.
So,
right.
So, I mean, one of the things about Nietzsche is Nietzsche's like, hey, the moment you can talk about decadence, you're already in the decadent period. I mean, it's like, that's his thing about like ancient Greece. The moment you can start rationally talking about the systems of decadence for Nietzsche, too late. You're already there. It's already too late.
You could kind of see his point, that kind of makes sense.
Well, it's the hour. I mean, from the Hegelian perspective, which I know Jason's gonna like, it's the hour of Minerva. Like it always.
I mean, that's why I said it kind of makes sense.
Right? Like, there is a weird way. There is a weird way that Nietzsche is dark Hegel, even though there's not a lot of evidence that they had any knowledge of each other's work. So,
right. Yeah.
So there's something in the water in Germany, after the French philosophes fell, that led to this kind of thinking.
And when you look at like Arthur Moeller Vandenbroek, it's the reunification of dark Hegel and regular Hegel in coming up with the homegrown fascism of the or pseudo and proto-fascism of the conservative revolution.
Yeah. So, but because I think Spengler and Toynbee are our sources for this theory in the modern world, and because religious cycles that we mentioned earlier are so common, but progressives hate them, there is a tension where decadence theories were always seen to be right-wing. And indeed, I saw so myself for the early part of my life. So, and I want to get your, before we get into the articles here, we're pulling today from 3 articles. I will cite them or link them depending in the show notes. One is Decadence as a Theory of History by Neville Morley from New Literary History in 2014. One is Aufhebung Collective's Decadence, a Theory of Decline or a Decline of Theory, parts 1 through 3. You can find it at LibCom. It's from 2005, and it actually very much feels like it's from 2005 because I'll talk about why later. And then we're going to talk a little bit about Revolution or Decadence, thoughts on the transition between modes and production on the occasions of Marx's bicentennial by Samir Amin when he was hanging out in Senegal before his death. I don't think this book ever came out. Like this,
no, I don't think so. But it's the most recent article because it's from 2018.
Yeah, but he died very shortly after. Yeah. And what matters also because Samir Amin kind of got in hot water during the Egyptian Revolution for backing the Mubarak successor regime prematurely when the Brotherhood was ascendant, which I think a lot of people will be surprised by. Given
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a really bad. That's not a look that anybody wants to have. That's a bad look.
No.
Well, he thought that the Brotherhood. One of the things about Samir Amin that people don't realize, it might strike people as weird today, given third worlds tend to be kind of soft on Islamist. He hated Salafists.
I mean, I kind of sure.
So
that's the reason why sometimes you just have to be a pessimist. You just look and say, "Oh, everything sucks right now," rather than picking a side based on what there is.
Right.
The lesser evil is always still just evil.
Yeah. So I think that's something to note. Now, okay, so we got a definition of decadence theory. Now we're going to touch on 2 things before as we discuss this. I think we have to discuss more of the conservative part of this, but I think we're going to have to distinguish some things because in a lot of Marxism, there are capitalist decadence theories, capitalist breakdown theories, and capitalist crisis theories. And a lot of people, including Marxists, do not realize they are not the same things. They are associated with things like accelerationism, immiseration thesis, etc., etc., etc.
Right.
Imperialism thesis, state monopoly capital, the various theories of imperialism. When Hobson first came up with his theory of imperialism, which when Lenin and Bukharin are coming up with their ideas, they're seeing 2 tendencies that are discussed in Marx. One is capital crisis and breakdown, and 2 is monopolization.
Mm-hmm.
And they note that states are playing a larger and larger role in the monopolization and granting charters. And they see the beginning of something like what we would later call Fordism beginning to happen in Europe. And as a way to mitigate crises, the states are actually sanctioning monopolies. Now, one historical thing you can say about this analysis, it kind of misses that like most of the corporations that existed were also started as monopolies, like the East India Company and stuff like that. That was actually an early modern phenomenon during what liberals call the mercantile period. Anyway,
well, yeah, mercantilism is defined by monopoly and the merger of state and private monopoly. So it's always been there.
It's always been there. Neoliberalism is a particular form of it, but Fordism is too. Like, it's always been there. And in fact, one thing that's commonly leveled at Marx that may be true, may not be true, is that Marx took the entrepreneurial system that Smith was describing almost as a way to bring it about in response to the monopoly rentier system. Too much at face value, and that commodity exchange was the beginning of capitalism, right? Like that's actually a common critique, even by Marxist on Marx. Okay, so
and that's fair. Fair enough.
So Lenin's theory of imperialism is different than, say, Kautsky's theory of imperialism. In fact, that's one of the two differences. One is the embrace of the Simmerwald left. Two is the embrace of the imperialism thesis versus Kautsky's super imperialism, where he thought the capitalist world was going to coalesce into larger and larger trade blocks. It would not be likely to fight each other directly.
Like he thought that 1984 was real instead of
Kautsky.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, except that that's completely ahistorical to go see that. But here's the thing: in a way, Kautsky is right after Lenin's right, which is a weird thing to think about. Like, that does happen. I think the Soviet Union and the development of the atomic bomb is why it happens, and until that happens, the cost benefit ratio of war is still in the favor of capitalist states.
Right.
Yeah.
And even I mean, then, it's not so weird. It's only weird if you don't think it. History can happen in spirals.
Yeah, I mean, I was about to say, like, it's like Kautsky was right for the wrong reasons, and if you let him being right for the wrong reasons completely just if you dismiss everything he said because he was right for the wrong reasons, then you're missing what's useful. And I think that's something that we do a lot, is like completely dismiss people for being partially incorrect.
Yeah. Right. And we also uphold things said that are correct in a particular time as if they're eternally true.
Right. Yeah. Like, should we still be upholding Lenin's imperialism? Because that's what we did in the ISO.
I would say no.
Yeah, I would say no as well.
I think we have to think about, but where did he get that? We got it from Hobson, and he got it from Hilferding. Hilferding was coming up with a theory of monopoly capital. It was going to further play out the stuff that that is in Engels, but unlike Lenin, he actually took the classical Engels line that, well, you just let the capital completely monopolize and you just take over the state democratically and you're done.
Yeah.
Right? And you just democratize the workplace too, and then you're done. That's all you have to do.
Like Lee Phillips.
Yeah, Lee Phillips actually has. I just had him on the show. This will probably come out right after that. That's pretty much what he believes. Yeah, you're right. And Lenin goes, no, that's not going to work because there's too much inner competition. Now this gets us to the various decadence cycles. And breakdown theories and crisis cycles. I will say that you do not have a theory of capitalist crisis in Capital Volume 1. It's not there.
No, it takes till the third volume.
There is a theory of capitalist crisis in the revolutionary or the communist criticism. I always get if it's called the revolutionary criticism. Whatever the precursor draft to the manifesto written by Marx and Engels wrote by himself, you get a theory of capitalist crisis caused by the efficiency of machines early on. All right. And it is revised out of the manifesto. When they go and write the manifesto, that theory is taken out. But in Capital Volume 2, it comes back, but in a different form. It is the tension between fixed and constant capital, as picked up from Ricardo and William Pettis. And what this has to do with surplus value. All right. We know from letters that Marx believed in the 1850s there was going to be a final crisis of capitalism. But when it didn't happen, that's part of what prompted him to write Capital. He had this big, according to Hal Draper, he had this big project that he was going to try to map out all of bourgeois society. And he wanted to deal with the economic, literally, he calls it the economic shit first, and it ends up being his entire rest of his life work. He never gets to the other parts of the breaking down bourgeois society. And also because he thinks to understand the other parts, you have to understand the economic part. But that's why we don't have, for example, a fully articulated Marxist theory of state, or even a clear singular definition of what class is. These things aren't, we know class is related to the mode of production. That's clear. But famously, he just abandons the chapter when he's writing on in volume 3 on the definition of the working class or the proletariat and just drops it. Works through it. He keeps on hitting a wall where he keeps on saying, well, productivity to capital can't be definitionally of who's part of the product of the proletariat, but he can't figure out how else to parse it. And he just leaves it unfinished.
And
right? Famously,
he remains hopeful about the 4th, 5th, and even 6th volume, which he just never gets to. But I do believe he intended to, and I think that he thought he was going to get there. He just didn't do it.
He just knew it. So sometimes we call what theories of surplus value and volume 4.
But
again, so you have an attempt to explain the business cycle. It is partially based off the Ricardian and Smithian notion that there is a tendency of the rate of profit to fall because of the tension between fixed and variable capital, and that this tension is why there's problems in the market. Now, this leads to, I think, a tension in Marxism, period. And here's the tension. One, we believe that the proletariat has to be the subject of history because it's got to be the subject of revolutionary change. And the reason why it has to be is it's the only class that has no vested interest in a system and can socially reproduce itself.
Right.
Those two things together, right? But when you read Capital, that's not really part of the equation. It's not there. It's everywhere else. You can read it back in there because we know Marx believed it. But it's not actually in the theory. Right? I've read the book. I can't find it. So then you also have the breakdown theory. Right? The breakdown theory is capitalism is its own undertaker. All right. Now, the first theory about the proletariat already has that thesis. Capitalism is its own undertaker because it creates a proletariat, which is a class that can socially produce itself, but has no vested interest in it because it's parasited upon, so it can overthrow it. Different from the peasantries who do have vested interest in property ownership. So, even though they're an oppressed class and, we should make common cause with them in certain cases, they aren't going to be the subject.
Right.
Okay, so you have that. Put a pin in that. Then you have, capitalist rates of profit lead to more and more destabilizing economic crises, causing depressions, which make the system unstable. Put a pin in that. All right. Later on, the Austrian economist who also had a relationship to the Marxian and the German historical school Schopenhauer would actually use that to come up with a theory called creative destruction that actually, no, Marx is right about this, but it's good. It gets rid of the dead weight.
Schumpeter.
Yeah, Schumpeter. Yeah.
Oh yeah,
Schumpeter.
that makes
Yeah.
Not Schopenhauer. Schumpeter.
Did I say Schopenhauer?
Schumpeter.
Yeah. Oh, excuse me. I got
Well,
my S Germans confused.
I
Schumpeter.
was just trying to save you from someone correcting you later.
I appreciate it because I am, as I reach my 40s, I find that I like know the right person and grab the wrong name all the time. Anyway.
Same. Yeah. Jason's really good at doing that.
I'm awesome at doing that.
So
like Robin D.G. Kelly versus
Robin DiAngelo.
Robin DiAngelo.
Robin D.G. Kelly versus Robin DiAngelo versus R. Kelly? Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Versus Robin Hood.
Yeah.
Man, Robin Hood's theory of white fragility is pretty funny. Anyway.
It's all about how white people suck and you should take all their money.
Fair. So
I would disagree.
Yeah, the white people suck. I don't think white people are a coherent subject anyway. Exactly. Okay. So, well, what does this mean? Okay, so two theories of thought come out of this school. One is a theory that leads to the development of the business cycle. Marx actually contributes. He's the primary contributor even to neoclassical theory, even though they don't admit this. His crisis theory is the basis of the business cycle.
Right. Yeah.
Put a pin in that. But in the Second International, Kautsky and company start talking about the imminent demise of capitalism. And it is built into the Second International. The Aufhebung article mentions that those assumptions are maintained until the 1950s in the Third International and in the Bolshevik Party. Right. I find the Aufhebung article really frustrating because it doesn't mention that. But capitalist breakdown theory is why third periodism was justified. It's how the Popular Front was justified, believe it or not, etc. Like, there was an economic theory. It is only when the predicted crisis that both Trotsky and the Soviet Union predicted in the 1950s didn't happen, that the crisis in the 30s didn't immediately come back after the war, that you start seeing an abandonment of that theory. And what you start seeing a focus on in Leontov in the Soviet Union and in the late 40s, in both the Frankfurt School and in Paul Sweezy and Baron's theories, is a theory on monopoly, capital as finally getting advanced enough to end the crisis of capitalism, meaning there will be no more business cycle.
Right. I mean, like, what's his name?
Paul Sweezy?
No. Trotskyist, American Trotsky, James Kennan.
James Kennan.
Yeah, he was so convinced of the inevitable breakdown that it's like, well, obviously the Second World War hasn't ended yet because the Great Depression hasn't come back yet. It took a while for everybody to finally recognize, oh, maybe we were wrong. Like, in an absurd way, actually.
Yeah. So I mean, in some ways, actually, the reason why they throw this at Trotskyists and left comms more than they do at, let's call them post-left communists. It's hard to know what to call the socialism or barbary, the Marxist humanist or the Situationist international. What to call those guys, because they're not in either tradition.
They just kind of exist in this constellation of they're non-denominational, and at a certain point that becomes a denomination, but they're not. It's just very weird. It's impossible to categorize them.
They're the pre-68 precursors to the New Left, is what they are.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. That makes sense.
And in the case of socialism or barbary, what it devolves to when they give up on the decline cycle, and we'll get into this, we'll get into this in the when we discuss the Aufhebung piece, but I think it's fair. how do I say this? It is that they eventually become Euro-communists, and they even give up eventually on the working class. Like Lyotard comes out of that group. A lot of the post-structuralists come out of that group. The Situationist, they think that the spectacle, whatever the fuck that is, and media capital solves the problem.
In a different discussion, I will defend the concept, but for now, I'll just say, yeah.
No, well, I mean, my thing is, I think the spectacle is interesting, but it is so under theorized in the Situationists that it's hard to like do much with. I mean, I think the Frankfurt School does more with it.
I also think a lot of people take the concept and they run with it, and they run with a part of it, whichever part they like them best, and they make it far less clear than it. So instead of making it more clear and further elaborating, they do the opposite.
Yeah. So you have that response. And in the Marxist-Leninist circles is what I didn't love, and the reason why I'm going over this separately from the Aufhebung articles, I think we do have to talk about this. In the Marxist-Leninist world, what that leads to is various theories of national liberation replacing class struggle.
Yeah,
like formally.
Right.
And this gets accelerated for political reasons in the Sino-Soviet split. So, okay, we have those theories, and this is a very basic gloss. We're 45 minutes in, and I've just covered the gloss. What's decadence theory then? Well, we have this theory of decadence that has pre-Marxist origins, and we have this theory of decline and breakdown. Well, okay, so some people go on the monopoly capital, then the 70s happens, all right? And then people like the Johnson Forrest tendency and the Marxist humanists say, okay, well, the crisis theory is true, but the capitalists can find a way to either expand markets, the Rosa Luxemburg theory, which we haven't even talked about, or destroy surplus production or increase consumption. They can do all of these things and restart the cycle.
Mm-hmm.
So you return back to a theory of business cycle. All right. Really, only at this point, Trotskyists and very specific kinds of left comms, like council communists, like Paul Maddock, maintain that capitalism's going to collapse tomorrow. But in the 70s, the return of the business cycle in a big way really does lead to these collapse theories coming back. And you see that with Mandel, in his Late Capitalism book. And you see it with, a bunch of stuff. But one of the interesting things about this period of Trotskyism is that, weirdly, even though they have to explain why Trotsky's predictions in the transitional program were wrong, because in the transitional program, he says capitalism's going to end by the 1950s. He says it.
Right. Yeah.
Everyone just kind of brackets that out. It's like, dude, we don't talk about that part of this anymore. But so you have a question, and one of the things that starts coming up in left communist circles, and particularly in the council communists who are influenced by people like Maddock, was that, okay, they start thinking, well, the cycle theory is true, but maybe we're wrong about the breakdown. Maybe it can decay into barbarism. And that is the beginning of capitalist decadence theory as opposed to just breakdown or crisis theory. Okay. Now, what does that mean?
Well, for one, it means, I think, regardless of what else it means, it at least means a lot more nimbleness on the part of thinkers, trying to think their way out of an impasse that they shouldn't have been in the first place.
Right, and it jettisons the teleological aspect of Marxist view of history, right? Like, if we can just devolve into barbarism, then that at some point you have to if you think that we can just evolve into barbarism, you have to admit that there is a possibility of the stalling out of the dialectic, right? You have to basically just exercise yourself of that Whiggishness that's not supposed to be there anyway.
Right.
And this is why, and let's talk for a second. Marxist, Leninist, Trotskyist, etc. Even Second International Social Democrats, until after the war, all maintain before World War II, communism is inevitable.
Right.
It will happen. It is not an act of will. That famous quote is a force to be, to which the world must reconcile.
I mean, that's why Kautsky could say that the Social Democratic Party is a revolutionary party. It is not a revolution-making party.
Right.
All we're supposed to do is just be revolutionary, and then at some point, history will vindicate the way we're being.
Right, and Hilferding seems a little less insane, right?
Right.
Yeah. And Lenin's the one who says, "Well, history might need a push."
Right. Yeah.
He was right.
He was right. At the time, and maybe again,
he wasn't right for all time, but he was right for his time.
I mean, Lenin is one of the most insightful Marxist thinkers of the 20th century. He's also one of the most all over the place, though. If you actually read him, he changes his mind all the fucking time.
Yeah, there's not a thing that's actually, there's no such thing as a Leninism, because he doesn't have one position on any one question. He always has at least two, depending on the year and depending on all kinds of circumstances.
I mean, what is it that Eric von Rhee accuses all the Marxists of doing, is trying to make Lenin more consistent when they're all quoting Lenin accurately against each other. Like Stalin's quoting Lenin accurately against Trotsky, who's quoting it accurately against Kamenev, who's quoting it accurately against Zinoviev, who's quoting it accurately against Bukharin. And they're all just pretending that Lenin wasn't vacillating to try to figure it out.
Lenin wasn't St. Paul, he's a different kind of person.
One year at the Socialism Conference, there was a big argument between Paul D'Amato and what's his name, Jason? The
Lars Lee.
Because Lars Lee talks about how Lenin changes his mind at this point, and then he changes his mind at this point, and Paul D'Amato is just like, no, Lenin never changed his mind.
Yeah, I mean, I got that. That was my big fight with the Marxist humanists. I'm like, yeah, I don't agree with Althusser about there being a clear epistemological break, but the idea that from Marx's beginning to the end of his life that it was all the same, it's nuts.
It's stupid. It's not even a standard that you would want to hold any other living person to.
Right.
And well, that's the thing. Is it's like he's elevated to the level of a prophet rather than a thinker. And if you look at the red words in the Bible, man, there's some contradictory stuff in there.
Right.
Yeah.
I think this gets us to where we are today, though, because after the 1950s, the question doesn't become, is communism inevitable? The question is it just a political matter, or is it a political economic matter? Right. And today we get to stuff like, I don't know how people who believe in techno-neo-feudalism, which you and I all think is an incoherent concept, but how that isn't actually just a decadence theory.
Yeah.
Right. And for people who want to know where we get the decadence theory, there is a place in Marx to get it. It's the Brumaire. It's not the economic theories.
Right.
What is it that Marx says about what liberals start to do when they start to lose and hit economic or political problems? They go back and they return to the old order.
Yeah. They turn to a strongman to reassert the old order and stabilize things.
Correct. That's the theory of Bonapartism. Mm-hmm. So Bonapartism is a political theory of decadence, but it's just a political theory of decadence. We can hold Marx accountable for not working it out all the way across because, well, this is a totality in Marxism, or it isn't. If the mode of production is not a totality, you have to abandon Marxism altogether. I'm just going to say that outright. If you don't believe market relations are totalizing, Not that markets are totalizing, but that market relations under capital are totalizing. Right. You're not a Marxist because you don't actually believe that the mode of production is the base of society.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense.
Right. So okay, this gets us to a question then. Well, then what does decadence mean here? Now here, I'm going to actually get us into one of the articles. Finally.
Goddamn 1 hour in, we're going to start talking about one of the articles. Honestly, though, this is one of the least meandering episodes we've ever done.
It's just a necessarily long prehistory. Right. That's important.
And we had to start off with defining what modernity was.
Yeah, I mean, I always feel like whenever I go to with people like, Varn, why do you front load your interviews and stuff? I'm like, have you ever taught a class and you realize like, y'all don't know what any of these words fucking mean? Like,
yeah.
So we
I have.
yeah. Speaking of decadence, you and I are both teachers. So
yeah, dude, we are in a stage of decadence now that makes the collapse of the Roman Empire relatable, really.
Yeah.
You know, that is how many, almost 1,000-year long collapse of the Roman Empire.
Yeah. I mean, it depends on which part, and fuck if you really want to. Sometimes even like, you know what? Let's even include the Ottomans as the Romans. I don't know, why not?
The Sultanate of Brunei.
Yeah. So it's not like the religion of the Roman Empire didn't change a couple times anyway.
Yeah, sure.
Like, why not? Why not?
Right. No, the one that stuck around and was conquered by the Ottomans, they were all Greek anyway, right?
Yeah, exactly.
They'd even changed ethnicities.
They just changed languages. That wouldn't even be the first time that's happened. So, so if we go back to the Neville Morley piece, and I'll just read this: the concept of decadent, especially when applied to a society or a culture, but in many cases when applied when also used in terms of aesthetic criticism, is closely related to the ideas of temporality and historical change. It rests on a sense of difference between past and present, and on a sense of the meaning of that difference. All right. So when we talk about the way everyone today feels like, oh, the future's been canceled, or people talk about, well, the American empire is declining. And I'm always like, okay, but like everywhere in the capitalist system has had better days recently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, except for like the people in the biggest periphery who are still coming up. Like, and if people don't believe me, go look at China's GDP rates right now.
Yeah.
Like, so sure, yes, America's declining, and it's declining internally, culturally too. I agree. But a lot of places are declining. Right. This whole vision of Steven Pinker that we were never going to have another World War II, like, and that like violence was going to decrease forever. You know, I think that's here's my funny take. I think when a lot of people go, "Oh, Fukuyama was wrong," what they really mean is Steven Pinker was wrong. Because Fukuyama just said, "Oh, we're just stuck in atomization," right? And things are going to get more and more atomized. And I'm going to say this kind of interestingly, Fukuyama implies a theory of decadence.
Yes, he does. Like Fukuyama's End of History is one of the most maligned
and not read.
Yeah. Like he's actually kind of right, and he kind of accidentally agrees with us.
Yeah. I actually pointed this out when I was reading the Dubin book. Like Dubin agrees with Fukuyama, he just thinks Fukuyama's bad. Like, you know, but Fukuyama doesn't seem happy about the end of history.
No,
right. I think that's a major misunderstanding. He's writing about a thing and he's not celebrating it at all.
Fukuyama and Gorbachev both are people who, like Gorbachev was trying to stabilize the Soviet Union to live on for, you know, another 70-something years. And then Fukuyama was lamenting the collapse of a concept of progress in the future. And then both were welcomed wholeheartedly by liberalism and changed their grift in order to fit in.
Right.
I mean, one of the interesting things about Fukuyama is he recognizes something inherent in liberalism going all the way back to Hobbes, you know, the first authoritarian liberal. the beginning of the right wing of liberalism. Right, the Hobbes is a shadow underbelly of liberalism. He's the absolutist underbelly of liberalism that people want to bracket out and say is not liberal.
Yeah,
but he accepts everything that liberals accept. Human equality. In fact, he accepts human equality so much that he has a theory of atomizations and monads. He believes that people are like cells are to bodies and atoms are to matter, that people are individuated, free-floating units.
nothing more liberal than that.
Right. And all his theories, all his theories of like state control are actually based off that. Right. And he believes this so thoroughly that even though he's not an atheist, he's actually a kind of stoic Christian. And when I say stoic, I don't mean stoic in the sense of like, oh, he doesn't have emotions. I mean stoic in the sense that he believes in a literal material God. Like that God is made of matter because everything is made of matter. And he
believes in the demiurge.
So he's a weird heretic, but nonetheless, that's implied in his theory. Yeah. One of the things Fukuyama realizes is that by the time we are today, that beginning instance of the atomization metaphor that you see all the way back in Hobbes at the end of the English Civil War, that's all that's left of liberalism. There is no grounds of agreement on anything else. Now, we can see that ideologically, but we are not just ideological. If we were just ideological reductionists, we'd all be conservatives. In fact, we might even be far rightist.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? So, like, why? Our question is, if this is true, and we can see this today, like, we can see this breakdown into, I talk about this in the way liberals talk. They talk about systemic systems, but then they talk about everyone's individual choice. And we have to recognize
that's
as,
how liberals believe in systems.
Right.
Is the aggregate of everyone's individual choices.
Right.
Right.
And they don't see part of the choices as the feedback loop which creates multiple people at a time. Yeah. Like they believe in individuals, not persons. And they talk about bodies.
Yeah.
Not persons. What is a person? A person they are individuals, right? But your language, does it come from you? No. Your culture, does it come from you? No. And that's not just like obvious stuff like, oh, you're white or black or whatever. That's what we focus on because those are categories that we think have. But that's about everything.
Right.
Are you from Texas or from Georgia? Are you from the city or not? Like what's the weather like when you grow up? Are you exposed to too much sugar as a child? What's your relationship like to your mom? Like all these things are because you are not an atom. You are an ever-changing thing that can only be understood in terms of your context. And what are the most important contexts? Social relations.
Right.
Right. So we have to ask ourselves today, and I think to get back into these articles, why are we decadence theorists and not just breakdown theorists or not just crisis theorists? And remember, we've already said that there is a slight difference, but you can be a crisis theorist and not a breakdown theorist. You can say there's no final crisis. There's nothing that's going to prompt the breakdown. Right. And then I think I am that, but then I say, okay, if nothing prompts the breakdown, if Grossman's wrong, right? And the immiseration thesis is wrong, and accelerationism is wrong. Well, what does that mean? And for me, it means we have to look at the effects of this system continually restarting and breaking down because entropy is a thing.
Right.
You cannot restart from the same starting point every time. You cannot rebuild, when an economy was doing good in the 19th century and 20th century, what kind of GDP growth are we looking at? 20, 30%, right?
Yeah.
An economy is doing good now if you are a mature market economy, and I'm going to use market to make the people who don't believe China is capitalists happy. What is the best, absolute best fucking GDP you can expect? Like 6%?
Yeah, I was going to say 4. but
yeah, and it's not like
absolute
4 or
best.
5.
Yeah,
right. Like
somewhere around 5. Yeah.
what is China's like optimum goal for itself right now? 5%. It's not even doing that, but that's 5%. We've been talking about how the economy is amazing. Well, we haven't. Democrats have. Because the net economy, mostly for the super rich, is growing at what?
5%? About 5%. Yeah.
Yeah.
5.
right. And I was told the other day, stupid me, that the economy is a thing that's completely different from the buying power of the poor. It's not the same thing. You need to quit conceptualizing it like that. The buying power of the poor and wages, that's not the economy.
The economy is the sum total of all human activity.
Yeah, I know.
So like freaking
Right,
no, but if you're just trying to say that the economy is good, then you can't consider any of that other stuff. You can't consider real wages. You can't consider buying power. You can't consider like inflation, food inflation. You know.
Well, yeah, but why do they want you to focus on that? Well, the problem is the economy is good. It's just not good for you because you're on the losing end of a class project, motherfucker. Like, and they just don't want to say that last part. Like, which, by the way, we have to also be honest. One of the things about modern life that is super frustrating is things are bad for the poor under Republicans, but they barely claim to care and think that you can deal with it by private charity.
Right.
right.
Things are bad for the poor under Democrats, but they do claim to care. And often, Democrats create so many rentier systems and things that require you to game systems that they actually get worse for the poor.
Yeah.
I mean, I was thinking about this.
Case of point, California.
Yeah.
Well, there's lots of different examples of this. Like, maybe my favorite one, or at one point it was my favorite one to point to, was that if you lived in a conservative state and that meant your governor like rejected the Obamacare mandate, which means that you were no longer forced, if you live in like Alabama or Texas, you weren't forced to buy healthcare that you couldn't afford. That makes the Republican Party the lesser of two evils.
I mean, this is
at least in that context, yeah.
Right. Although also they tend to turn down money that help the poor. But anyway, we could get it. Like my point is that it's bad for the poor pretty much no matter what in this.
Yes,
system.
right. Exactly.
It's just that one party doesn't lie about it as much. So
I just thought of an easy way to conceptualize what a decadence theory is. And as if you've ever seen the movie Multiplicity, you know, where the copy of the copy of the copy just keeps degenerating into a worse and worse form. And it finally comes to the guy who puts like pizza in his pocket and talks about having sex with the dolphin or whatever.
That's about where we are right now.
Yeah, that's where we are.
History.
Right. And you see this when we talk about hauntology and we talk about repetition compulsion. And another thing that implies decadence is first as tragedy, then as farce.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, now it's not even farce. Like first as tragedy, then as farce, then as tragicomedy, then a stupid fucking meme, and now it's some dumb tweet. Like, I mean, like it's like
we're on the travesty. Yeah. Tragedy, farce, travesty.
Tragedy, farce, travesty. I mean, like you think about, think about the life-changing technologies you've been sold as life-changing at the end of the 20th century in the beginning. I know people push back. I remember listening to you guys' show on secular stagnation, right? And people are like, "Oh my God, there's so much stuff going on in communications technology," and I'm like,
"No, there's not.
No, there's not. The biggest innovation in communication technology is now 2 decades old. Yep. This has not fundamentally changed that much other than getting better cameras.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still using the iPhone 8 right now, and it doesn't matter.
Now think about computers from the 70s to the 90s. Cheaper,
about computers from
better. Well, go ahead.
Computers from like 89 to 92 even.
Right.
Oh, dude, computers. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Like, are from the 60s to the 90s. Like, a computer in 1960 takes a whole fucking room. Like, and has a display like this large, and you can mainly do punch cards. Like, it actually, I don't know why we thought it was more efficient than just using people. But nonetheless, we haven't seen innovations like that at all. even in light of war. Okay. I had this really horrifying. You know how I've said that the military is really the only people in the room that still like has any sense because they have feet in the game. The Houthi situation is actually making me even re-question that.
Yeah, well, that was that. One of the articles that we read for that episode that we did talked about how drone technology and stuff like that is actually really just rehashing the same thing they've been working on for 20 years and isn't nearly as advanced as we think it is.
No, I mean, like, and also, like, you could figure out drone technology from, like, remote radio cars. I mean, like,
Right.
if you look like the base technology of it, it's not anything like now.
It's not all that different. It's not supremely significantly different from basically the drones that the Nazis used in the late part of the Second World War.
When were your grandparents born?
Grandparents?
I think, well, depends on but roughly the 30s.
Mine was in the 20s. Okay, so
late 20s. Yeah, 20s.
No, early 20s. Early 20s.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I guess so. I guess if you're right.
My grandfather worked at a brick mill most of his life. Okay, still making bricks. So that was very constant. But like when he was born, there were still horse and buggies on the road.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
When he died, you were beginning to have I think he died like the year Tesla started. Like now, I do not see in power production and logistics. You know, we've seen there was a lot more hope about genetic technology 10, 20 years ago than there. There's a lot more fear about it too. You notice people aren't afraid of that anymore?
Right, like CRISPR babies, you mean?
Yeah, people aren't afraid of that anymore.
Yeah.
You know why? Or VR. Do you remember when everyone thought the VR was going to really change the fucking world?
Mm-hmm.
Like, and yeah, the VR headset's kind of cool, but like it was supposed to be cool in 1992. Like,
right. Okay. VR is just about as cool as it was in the late 90s.
Right.
It's barely advanced, except for that the graphics
are better
because graphics in general are better.
But then, like, have there been massive improvement in graphic card technology since the mid-aughts?
No. I'm still running. I'm running the same video game graphics card in my 2010 computer now and playing new games.
So the question is why, right? And I've heard a lot of people say, "Oh, China's going to fix this for us."
No, they're not.
No,
but they don't seem to be, right? As people who study, Jason Moore came on my show. He's one of the socialist ecologists, kind of broke with both Sato and Bellamy. He's neither in the bright green nor the degrowth side of that. He's just pointing out that, like, you know, the easy stuff is gone. The low-hanging fruit is gone, and it's even getting hard to leapfrog. Phil Neal came on the show, and, like, look, he's like, automation has made it to where, like, people are fighting for production, but you don't actually need that much production anymore. Mm-hmm. The stuff is super automated. It's labor efficiency. You can't get much better and be profitable.
Right.
And also it means that, like, oh, you get a factory and it might help, you know, your city, but it's not helping the entire region or the country anymore.
Right.
And then the military right now is so driven by profits that they can't even figure out a way to mandate cheaper supply lines to fight a fucking war.
Oh man. I just watched a video the other day about the littoral combat ship mm-hmm. and how it was supposed to be like a shallow water vessel that was meant to, basically for fighting the Houthis, essentially, is what it was meant for. And it is, first of all, just completely unaffordable and doesn't work. It's a total complete piece of shit. And they're going back to destroyers now as a result of that. And using destroyers, they have like, an entire fleet of combat ships meant for fighting against the Houthis that they're not using in this engagement at all. Because, first of all, the technology that was used to build it didn't pan out. It's too expensive, and everything's a piece of shit, falls apart. And that is a perfect example of decadence in the economy applied to the one area of technological innovation that's not supposed to be affected by it.
Right. And let's also talk about this. Like, we all know that meritocracy is bullshit, but we used to know that there was relative meritocracy because the ruling class needed to have the competence to rule, so they would pull people out. And that was also a way to maintain the ideology that meritocracy was real.
Right. And if you look at like, the wise men, right, of the 1940s and 50s, right? And then you look at Joe Biden and his cabinet now. You're like, well,
right.
There used to be some relative meritocracy because those guys were, if nothing else, incredibly smart and competent.
Right. And that couldn't even be explained by stuff like term limits and like people try to do. Like, well, Xi and Putin don't have that problem. They don't have term limits and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, they seem to be having problems, not as bad as ours. Mike Davis dies, and 2 years ago. And he wrote that Thanatos Ascendant piece. And he's like, look, collective leadership's gone everywhere because no one trusts it anymore, even in the places that are traditionally collectively leaders. And yeah, some people are trying to valorize these strong men as ways out of it, but it's all he strongly implied it's all renegade Bonapartism, and we have no reason to hope.
Right.
No,
I mean, like not long ago. I mean, I guess it was kind of a while ago, but like the people like James Burnham, when they talked about the managerial revolution, all the concerns about like the ways in which technocrats, layers of very, very highly specialized people would run things, and that's according to some position, we even call that desirable. But now it's like it's a delusion. I couldn't even imagine thinking that now.
Joseph Tainter and the Rise and Collapse of Complex Civilizations, a book that if you have not read, it's not Marxist. He's got some pretty big misunderstandings of Marx in it, actually. But if you want to like get his view of systems like this, and it's based off of ecology, as much as anything else. He's like, yeah, these things run their courses, and sometimes they cannot restart. He does say there are societies that can do it. And then sometimes there are societies that collapse where other societies grow out of them immediately, and most people just attach to the new society. But sometimes they just stall out and die. All right. Now, I think that theory is kind of a problem for Marxists, but we see evidence of it everywhere. The thing is that most people are so parochially tied up in their own immediate domain of it that I have a hard time imagining this is just like the way Americans talk about everywhere else is somehow it's way more vital than the United States. Have you fucking seen Europe?
Right.
Yes, it has slightly more humane labor laws and stuff, but
for now,
in some places, for now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the European Union in general has,
But
for now.
And yes, I'd rather be a worker in, say, Sweden or Denmark than France, and I'd rather be a worker in France than the United States, and
so on. Yeah,
and so on.
Don't let Mir hear you say you'd rather be a worker in Sweden.
No, well,
Mir's not going to hear it though.
Well, Mir and I talked about it because he's like, well, as bad as it is in Sweden, I'm always amazed that it was that bad. I'm like, the thing is, we're not declining. We've always kind of been this way.
Yeah,
like our period of that, it was very short. And if also in the beginning of the 20th century, if you were going to predict who is going to have more progressive labor laws and whatnot, which country would you have predicted? If you were going to let Britain or France or Germany or the United States, who's going to have better labor laws?
Well, I mean, it would seem like the United States is going to, based on the strength of the labor movement.
The strength of the labor movement, the reform movements, like a lot of the British reforms are actually based off American reforms, both in the bad racist sense, but also in the good work protection sense.
Right. I mean, it took a whole hell of a lot of fucking violence to get to where we are.
Absolutely.
At the beginning of the 20th century. Like the utter just smashing of the labor movement, jailing of its leaders, deportation of its leaders, Yeah.
And in Europe, they were so afraid of that, plus the recent major wars and mass politics that emerged in Europe in the early 20th century, and also the communists, that they just made the concessions preemptively.
Right.
Not to say that there was not a militant European labor movement, and there's still more of a militant European labor movement in the United States. But if I was going to guess where the labor movement was going to be strongest, well, if you think about the history, you would have said maybe the United States or maybe Britain. But then let's think about decadence.
But actually, before we think about decadence, let's take a bathroom break.
All right. Okay. So I'm going to ask you guys a question as we get into this. And I mentioned the 3 articles that we're going to base this first part of the series. I think we're also probably going to just start adding stuff to the series, and this might be a fairly long-running series for the show, for both our shows. So sorry, double subscribers, you're going to get it twice. But because I do think it really needs to be talked out, parsed, and dealt with, because one of the problems with talking about decadence is that, one, historiography right now is terrified of this.
Yes.
Liberal historiography is fucking terrified. They don't believe in progress anymore either. I mean, like,
no, they don't believe in progress, but they don't want to believe that there's no, that they don't believe in progress, but they don't want to believe that there's a possibility for degeneration.
Right, they want to believe in stasis.
Yes,
maintaining whatever is the whatever. Right. That's what they want to do.
And actually, weirdly, now they do it to the point that you like that, you know, and you see this in David Graeber too, where, like, basically, because this has origins in this, like, you know, the state has origins in family, and family has origins in kinship bonds, and that's both symbolic and a little bit biological, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Therefore, the state is nothing but kinship bonds, which is absurd. Like, it's like, and that you see this a lot of time. Oh, well, you know, guilds, you know, Colin Drum, friend of the show, smart man. I'm not saying this to degrade him, but he once made the argument that guilds are basically special interest groups. And I'm like, yes, that's true. But also, they're in a completely different context, and they had more social control. So, and they weren't just about lobbying the king or whatever. Like, so there's this, there is right now a historiography of flattening out in every direction. Right. That's bad. I think that's unequivocally bad. I don't think, for example, I don't think that modern humans are, you know, have this. I remember, for example, do you guys remember when all the liberals were talking about the Flynn effect as the thing against all the race and IQ people? So the Flynn effect.
I'm sorry, the Flynn effect?
Yeah, the Flynn effect is that if you look at IQ stats,
they're increasing. They're going up.
They were increasing every half generation from the 1930s until the early aughts. And then everyone even though liberals discovered the Flynn effect around that time, they didn't mention that the Flynn effect has stopped.
Right. IQ is supposed to measure innate ability.
Right, and it doesn't, basically. It doesn't,
no. But what it does measure is education, right?
Broadly speaking. It measures education. It also measures
social adaptation,
stress. I mean, like, stress affects IQ, right. Which is part of why race does. I mean, to be quite honest.
Which is why when I was a little kid, my IQ was off the charts, and now I'm an idiot.
Right. Oh,
that's why.
I mean, there have been studies where if you take someone from like a war-torn country into a non-war country and you give them an IQ test in both scenarios, believe it or not, you know, like the thing, your IQ raises. Okay, some of that also, there's no way to give it any kind of test that doesn't have social and cultural biases in it, because language always does. You know, that's fair. But one thing that I'll say is that when they dropped the Flynn effect, they basically just turned on testing entirely. And Freddie DeBoer, you know, you can disagree with him on a lot of stuff, and I do, actually. But he's right about one thing. They replaced it with something worse. They replaced it with, like, grades, but you know what grades tie to? Your zip code and your skin color, more than anything else.
Right. Yeah.
More than even success after high school. But although your zip code is a big predictor of your success, so you can look at that. That was not always true. All right. The complexity of this system, in a very real sense, in the 19th century, if you were a robber baron, you could have really been born from nothing. Yeah. A lot of them actually were. I know people disbelieve that, but it is true. Right?
Yeah.
This is
There
not
actually used to be a little bit of truth to the Horatio Alger bullshit.
Mhm.
There was a kernel of truth that was there.
Only a very, very few people could do it.
Mm-hmm.
Society wouldn't function if everybody could do it. But some people could. Now it's not true at all.
No, not at all.
Right.
Like
Literally no billionaires exist on the planet right now that didn't inherit their wealth. A majority of it anyway.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I read that stat recently and it blew my mind. Right? I'm like, how can we not think? So this is when I was like, okay, we have our problems with the techno-neo-feudal thesis because it doesn't, not because it's wrong about capitalism, because he's wrong about what feudalism was.
Right.
Like,
it's a category error.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think people caught that why we agreed with Morozov was that, like, this was a category error. Now, this is going to bring me to the Samir Amin piece, and I'm going to talk about the truth of it, because I do think there's a little bit of truth of it here. Capitalism is more, but I know this is going to make Samir Amin uncomfortable. Capitalism is more dynamic in the periphery than the core.
Yeah. Wait, does he not say that? I think he does.
Yeah, he does. He does say it, but he thinks that that's why there's socialist revolutions there.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
And I'm just like, and then he's like, well, but okay, I admit that they're not actually living up to socialism, but they can always go back. And I'm like, how? This is the thing. What to believe this? We're gonna get into this article. Then let's talk about this one because this was the one I want to get out the way. Because I don't hate Samir Amin, and I think as we read this, although there's some there's some assertions in this that are just wrong. Marx never reduced capitalism to a new mode of production. He didn't talk about capitalism much at all. He talked about bourgeois society, but he did say bourgeois society was a new mode of production.
I don't even think he ever actually used the word capitalism.
Sometimes
he talks about bourgeois society all the time.
He talks about capital.
He talks about capital.
He talks about bourgeois society, capital, and he talks about the private mode of production.
Right. I used to think that Werner Sombart invented the word capitalism, but I actually discovered it's earlier. But I think it's somewhat contemporaneous to Marx.
I started reading Werner Sombart in German just recently for a project, and his National Socialism that he wrote whenever he became full-fledged Nazi.
Oh yeah. I think Werner Sombart would be important if he hadn't become a Nazi, and I think it's interesting. I was doing this thing on what we talk about when we talk about class. It was a series I was running, and I hit Sombart and he stopped it because I actually couldn't figure out why is he the one Nazi that no one will touch? Is it because he was a Marxist first? I don't know. Because yes, people translated his Why Aren't Americans Socialist book, although it's interesting because what he describes in is partly settler. He didn't call it settler colonialism, but it's partly settler colonialism he's describing. But the other thing is Americans actually do have some hope of improving themselves, so they reinvest. American workers reinvest in their future, whereas European workers drink themselves to death.
Yeah.
Today, American workers drink themselves to death.
Yep. More than ever.
More than ever. More than even in the alcohol plagues of the Old West.
Yep. Deaths of despair are worse now than in recorded history. Because I know they didn't always record that, but
Yeah, it's bad, right? Yeah. It's absolute. And you know what? The left quit fucking talking about it.
Right.
They started talking about the third world.
Well, except for to talk about how they deserve it, right? Because it's
I don't see that. I think that's
most
true.
People don't, but yeah.
But I don't see that anymore. I saw that a lot more 5-6 years ago.
Well, I would say I'm specifically thinking of in regard to how white men are the ones who are most affected by deaths of despair. And within the last year or so, I've seen, they fucking deserve it kind of talk on Twitter. Obviously, it's a cesspool, and I shouldn't be on there, and I'm usually not.
Well, I do think looking into the abyss of the id of both the left and the right is what Twitter gives you.
Right.
Also, perversely, it gives you a way to like have your enemies spread your own ideas. But
right. When you stare into the abyss, it'll stare back, right?
Yeah, it'll stare back, and then mock share tweet you and make you more popular. It's a weird set of incentives. But I do think we can over conclude from Twitter. Yes. I heard a lot more of that
for sure.
I heard a lot more of that from like white progressives 10 years ago.
Right.
Even for people I thought were decent. A friend of mine was like, well, why aren't white people doing better? There's no reason why a white person couldn't do. And I'm like, I literally almost, I got so mad at him, I had to leave the room. I mean, he's a good friend of mine, and I almost punched him.
Yeah. It's still, that sentiment is still out there. I don't know if it's as prominent as it used to be, but you'll still find comedians making like,
yeah, you'll hear it. Yeah.
How do you fail when you're given a head start? All that kind of shit.
Yeah, but I mean, even that, I think that has that misunderstands whiteness as it's like everybody's a wasp and that everyone came here with property the way that
right.
Like yes, all the old leadership is white. That does not translate all the way down, and it never has.
They need to at least recognize a gradient that starts, let's say, in the north of England, and then by the time you get to the south, like in Greece, it's a different. They're white people, but not by any of the terms that you mean them to be.
Well, also whiteness as a category makes more sense in the Americas than it does in Europe anyway.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Right, because like technically Roma are white, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, easily the most hated people in Europe.
Yeah, I was just reading how they were burning down Roma apartment buildings again in Germany. Lovely.
Yep. Right. Well, I mean, you look at Turks. Turks are mostly white, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
They're all genetically Greek, but ask any European. Turks are not white.
Well, ask any Turk, and they're definitely not Greek.
They're Greek.
Yeah.
Have you seen those pictures of the kids of the youngest generation of the Osman dynasty that still exist? All little blonde-haired, blue-eyed like Zoomers.
Yeah, I saw that. All right, so Marx never reduced capitalism to a new mode of production. It's technically true because he didn't use the word capitalism, but no, bourgeois relations were a new mode of production. Well, he considered this next line is true. He considered all the dimensions of modern capitalist society. This is false. Understanding that the law of value does not regulate only this is true. Understanding that the law of value does not regulate only capitalist accumulation, but also rules all other aspects of modern civilization. I just think he doesn't know. I think Samir Amin doesn't know that mode of production implies that anyway.
Right. So he never reduced everything to the mode of production. That's probably true. That's fine. Except it depends on what you mean by reduced and what you mean by mode of production. If you just mean, yeah.
I think Samir Amin, ironically, even though he's a Marxist-Leninist, is correcting a Marxist-Leninist reduction of what the mode of production means.
Yeah,
because for a lot of Marxist-Leninists, the mode of production is just capitalist technology, right? And the social and legal relations that are superstructural to that are important to the mode. Where relations of production are the mode of production, right? It's not just the technology; it's the social world in which the technology emerges in. Anyway, blah blah blah. So I that first sounds fine. So one thing I want to point out here, the contribution of Paul Baran and Paul Sweezy, the two Pauls, introducing the concept of surplus. Surplus is already in Marx. There's theories of surplus value is a whole fucking book in Marx. They didn't introduce that. What Paul Baran and Paul Sweezy did is argue against that one, that labor theory of value is still true, or was ever true,
right?
And two, that there's a decline, there's a tendency of the rate of profits to fall. right? And that led them to monopoly capital. So
they made it a lot harder to understand Marx. But that's about it.
I think this is a little bit of sophistry here with Amin. But I do think he's got a point that the dynamic parts of capitalism, and this is what makes it weird, because that wasn't true yet in the Tsarist and Chinese empires, in the Qing Empire, and in the Tsarist Empire,
the Romanov,
the Romanov Empire, yeah. The capitalism is not particularly dynamic yet, right?
No.
Can we agree about that? It was beginning to be right when World War I broke out.
Right. It's actually the result of the war itself and all the contractions of the economy in the world and the restructuring of global capitalism that makes the periphery dynamic over time.
Right.
It had not started yet. You're right.
Right. So ironically, what they're actually arguing here, and I think it's interesting they won't say it, is that, well, one of the things we have to admit the Soviet Union did was actually, introduce capitalist production methods into society, and then when it fell, it just unleashed them without any tether. I'm not saying that the Soviet Union was state capitalist. You guys know I don't think the Soviet Union made economic sense.
Right.
Like that's my thesis. It's like there's elements of everything in there.
The thesis,
the Soviet Union was a very long transition back to where it started.
Yeah. Although, people talk about like Stalin's massive literacy and education gains, which are absolutely real.
Yeah, of course.
They're totally predictable with industrialization. He just industrialized. I mean, we have to just admit Stalin's real victory was industrializing Russia in 10 fucking years.
Right.
Well, right. And if you read Stalin on Stalin's own work at the time, that's what he was trying to do.
Right.
Like, we need to catch up to the West in 10 years, even though we actually should take 100 years.
Right.
It's very clearly trying to crash course industrialize so that we can become socialists.
Yeah, and it led to what Plekhanov warned it would lead to, which was like, okay, you're going to have purges, social instability, random bouts of violence. Like, this is why I'm not it's all Stalin's fault guy, because I think pretty much if anybody had run through that period, it probably wouldn't have led to all the old Bolsheviks being killed. That's not excusable.
Right.
But and you probably could have handled the purges better, But let's be honest. You industrialize that fast, it's kind of going to go that way.
There's going to be immiseration. I mean, and honestly, this is not an apology for Stalin, but he was right when he said that there was going to be a big war against the West, and that the Soviet Union had to industrialize and militarize, or else be crushed.
He was just wrong about which side of the West was going to be.
Yeah,
right.
He thought it was going to be against France and England. Turns out it was against Germany.
Right.
Like, there's a version of history which says maybe Bukharin would have been better up until the war, and then of course the Soviet Union would have lost instead. But I mean, who knows?
I don't know that we know that though. I mean, that's the thing. Like, I actually don't know that I do think that there's some argument that Bukharin's policies would have taken too long to industrialize.
Yeah, that's what I think too.
But we also have to deal with the fact that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact actually helped the German war effort.
That's the thing. It's like there's a whole bunch of Go ahead.
Stalin's horrendous political decisions leading up to the Nazi seizure of power, I think, helped the Nazis seize power.
Yeah.
Right. Like, we can't just look at the Soviet Union and say, if this person was in the same position, everything would have been different. Because
but we also can't absolve Stalin totally.
No, we can't. We shouldn't. I'm just saying that, if one thing changed and one person was in position, everything else would be different too. So now we just don't know. We just don't know what would have happened. We all we do know is what did happen.
Right. I mean, because the other thing I'll say, and this isn't actually, if I'm completely honest, this is more Zinoviev than it is Stalin. But Stalin causing chaos and distrust in all the periphery parties in the Comintern. which
Right.
happened. Stalin taking out some of the best leaders of even the Chinese and Japanese communist parties, which happened.
Yeah.
You know, like he didn't just purge. This is another thing, people. He didn't just purge Russians,
Right.
Like in Mongolia, like the totally different communist party emerged from the Stalin years than the one that started them.
Right, and he's directly responsible for the purge in the Chinese Communist Party, not Chinese Communist, of the Chinese Communist Party from its alliance with the Kuomintang.
Yeah.
And so on and so on. Like everything would be different. Yeah.
Actually, in some ways, the Sino-Soviet split is actually Stalin's fault. But
almost entirely.
Right.
3/4 Stalin, 1/4 Mao.
That's true. That's a good point.
Yeah.
70% Stalin. which is probably why they couldn't actually be honest about whose fault it was and had to like come up with a reason to try to blame Khrushchev. But anyway,
that's exactly
all this is to say that this thesis is interesting if you ignore the fact that Amin is implying but not stating one of the things socialists did was bring capitalism to the developing world. So
I mean, and really, like, I think
which even could be defensible if they just fucking own it. Like,
right. I mean, if you admit that you're actually just doing Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution, which they were all doing, but would never admit to because, you know, Trotsky's were a fascist collaborator, right? No, if they were industrializing and carrying out the bourgeois revolution because the bourgeoisie didn't have the spine to do it, right? If they just admitted that that's what they were doing, you know, then
and they get and honestly, you know, the USSR gave more generous even than contemporary China development programs. You know, and if you wanted to enter the modern capitalist world, ironically, the person you dealt with was a communist. So, I mean, Nasser figured that out. As did the Gandhis. You know, like it's just funny. It amuses me to no end. But
and it makes logical sense from the strict stagist thinking of Marxism-Leninism.
Yeah, it does.
Right.
Although one of the things I find interesting that this piece does is, again, Samir Amin's a Marxist-Leninist. He's of the Maoist tradition. I don't know which one, but he's analytically of the world systems Wallerstein school. That's his analysis school.
I would say Samir Amin is more of the ML properly understood tradition because he's more defensist when it comes to China today. He's defensist for basically every version of China, including the Maoist version, but because he's defensist about post-Mao China as well. He's not a Maoist technically.
No, he would be an ML who is sympathetic to Marxism with Chinese character, or just socialism with Chinese characteristics.
I think that we determined that he's a post-Maoist of some sort.
Yeah, he is. I mean, because world systems theory, while it has roots in Maoism, is not Maoism.
Right.
Right.
It incorporates a whole lot of non-Marxist thought.
Hey guys, I'm gonna have to take off in about 15 minutes.
So let's finish, or at least get to a stopping point. So one of the things that I think is interesting that he brings up, and this will be our last stopping point. We'll pick this up next time on part 2 of From Dawn to Decadence with regrettable vlog. Thus, the similarities between the current situation and the era of the end of the Roman Empire have led those historians who are not proponents of historical materialism to draw parallels between the two situations. On one hand, a certain dogmatic interpretation of Marxism has used the terminology of historical materialism to obscure the thought on this theme. The Soviet historians spoke of the decadence of Rome while putting forward socialist revolution as the only form of new relations of production for capitalist relations. This is another reason why we might even call him a Marxist-Leninist who's actually post-Marxist-Leninist too. But
I think that's probably right.
he's got a point. Like the decadence of Rome question, I told you guys one of the reasons why we started No Royal Road is that transition is baffling, right?
Right.
If you want a clean stages theory, how you go from slave mode to serf mode, you know, it's, you know, the crude constructions of the Soviet interpretation of the historical stages that literally got put down twice ever in Marx and Engels, does not work.
Right.
Right.
You have to come up with new definitions in order to make it work.
Right. And the other thing that you have to ask is like, okay, if bourgeois, if all you needed for the beginning of capitalist relations were made possible by the social technologies of the Renaissance, why didn't the classical world produce capitalism? And you know, that's the question that animated our whole discussions about that, right?
Yeah.
You know, that's why we started the No Royal Road. So because you, Chris, also have been on this, like we're both the two people who are like, why did the ancient world go this way? And another thing I'm sympathetic to Samir Amin on is, why was capitalism a European phenomenon? Like, why did it not happen in even Byzantium or the Islamicate empires or the Caliphate or China, which had more resources you would think would be able to do it.
More
had
resources,
a long mercantile tradition, like
a long mercantile tradition, more resources, like expansive trade routes, cottage industries, you know, everything that you need.
An advanced bureaucracy, banking, they had all of it. like
a millennium long stable empire up to a certain point, you know.
I think that's why, actually.
Yes, that is
because
why
they had a stable empire for a millennium.
Well, and that's what we're getting at here is decadence.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is the question. The first theorist of imperialism who was kind of socialist adjacent, who was almost a proto-Keynesian, was Hobson, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Of modern imperialism versus, you know, its old forms. But Hobson thought that imperialism was not capitalism.
Right.
That what we recognized as capitalism had already collapsed. And that's why there was imperial. And Lenin goes, well, you know, look at this liberal theorist. He's got some things, but if we look at Hilfordian, we can just see, no, it actually is capitalism, right? But it does. This does lead me to ask the question, like, why don't we have a theory? Why do we only have theories of crisis and breakdown? Why don't we have a theory of capitalist decadence? And I think Samir Amin has a point here. Now we're going to get to where I disagree with him, you know, on the next episode. But given what we've discussed already about all the theories we get to, why is it only the Council Communist and one school of the Council Communist, the International Communist Current, and like world systems theory is another school that has a capitalist decadence. Although what's interesting about world systems theory that we're going to get to is they basically believe the bourgeois were never revolutionary at all, which is a major departure from
right.
That's an entirely different school of thought.
Yeah, right. I think it's so big that you have to say that it's different.
Yeah, like, you have to ignore the revolutions,
right?
Which is
well, he doesn't. He says
it's a funny way to be. It's a really funny way to not be revolutionary, to just have revolutions all the time.
Well, he says that they were peasant revolutions, and then I'm like, okay, so now we have to throw out Bonapartism. We have to throw out like what of Marxism's left when you do that. But
we also have to expand the definition of peasant.
Yeah, and we also have to explain why the peasants made all these revolutions in all these places and never once took power on their own terms,
ever. And actually, also a massive part of peasantry fought against these revolutions in most cases.
Yep.
Not in all.
Yeah.
In Mexico and in Russia, that's not the case, and in China, that's not the case. But in Europe, it's the case.
In France,
right?
In France,
yeah, in France is definitely the case.
And it's kind of the case in the British Isles too. Like,
yeah.
You know, who were more likely to be royalists? You know, like, I mean, there were levelers and I guess in the British Isles, it's actually a more mixed. The peasantry's all over the place.
Right. We've got a long history of radical peasantry trying to ultimately beseech the monarch for better conditions, but radically.
Yeah, right. Yeah, basically, we're gonna overthrow everybody but the king,
right?
Because like the king can control these assholes,
right? Like the Great Peasants' Revolt. They burned down the monasteries, they burned down the Lord's manors, and they marched to London and say, "Oh, hey, king, save us."
Yeah, and the king will throw them a bone and then kill them later. I mean, that's almost what always happens. Anyway, so this is a good place to stop because we've actually gotten into the articles. We will pick this up in a month, and we're gonna do these first 3 rounds, and I'm gonna go ahead and warn people. This might be a long discussion because I don't think people understand this when we talk about this. Like, Donald Parkinson asked me what I meant when I said I was a decadence theorist, and I was like, God, I'm gonna have to write a book. But let's
should write a book. Yeah.
We
that's your list.
I would read it.
We should add some conservative and some other Marxist thinkers into this thing, since we know we're going to do it for a while.
Yeah.
So because I think you will understand our stances on revolutionary pessimism, because people are like, why are you even adopting the revolutionary, non-revolutionary, pessimist optimist thing? And I'm like, well, like I'm not. Listen and you'll figure out. You can disagree with us, but like
you're like, how many hours have you got?
Yeah, right. Like there's a bunch of reasons. So
I mean, we've got people on our Discord all the time that are just like, "Oh, I really like your show, but I don't understand why you guys are pessimists."
Like, why wouldn't you be a revolutionary optimist? And I'm like, well, because I'm not a moron. No, no, I shouldn't use the word moron. I've been told that it was come up by a eugenicist, and we should never use words that have unpleasant origins.
Oh no, there goes the whole English language.
I was going to say, how many words can you use besides
none?
A, N, and the? All the rest of them are sus.
I was chastised for using Anglo-Saxon to talk about the Old English, and they said, well, Anglo-Saxons aren't real. There was a category come up with to support white supremacy. And I was like, well, then what do you call? You want me to call them the Anglo-Saxons, Jutes, Frisians, Danish? It's a shorthand, right? That represents everyone.
Yeah, and primarily the Angles and the Saxons, because primarily they are
two largest groups.
Yeah. Right. And also, I mean, yes, it was used to come up with white supremacy. Totally true. Absolutely. But also, it was their culture that became dominant. The white supremacist narrative that's wrong is that they killed all the Celts. They didn't. They just intermarried, and the Celts took Anglo-Saxon names.
Just like what always happens. What always happens all throughout history.
Humans are horny.
Right, I mean, cultural assimilation. It's genocide. Actual genocide is a 20th century thing, right?
Right. Probably. I think it does happen in the ancient world, but it's really rare, and it's like,
and even then, it's theorized that it probably happened because there's no written records of the genocides that we think happened, like the Dacian genocide, right?
I was going to say
we don't know.
The closest that we have is the Roman occupation of what we now call Romania,
right?
That one area, maybe,
right? But DNA evidence shows that they're still there,
right?
Oh, well, cool. So the Romanian,
and of course, DNA evidence is like,
yeah, I mean, DNA evidence says a lot of stuff.
And that's so like there's a bunch of Romanian nationalists who make a big deal out of the fact that DNA evidence shows that they're still there. Like we've been here forever, that kind of a thing. So I know I'm playing into a Romanian nationalist talking point. Sorry about that.
The last thing I want to get is different Slavic and post-Slavic nationalisms mad at me. Those people are serious.
That's true, man. Like you say the same stuff as me, you look the same, and you talk the same, in your language is even written the same.
And your language is probably mutually comprehensible to mine. It's just slightly different.
Well, the Romanians are the weirdos in that whole area, right? Being non-Slavic.
Speaking of romance
language. But actually having lots of Slavic DNA.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so do the Greeks today.
Yep.
Yeah. Wait, hold on. So the Greeks, because you're saying they're Macedonian?
Uh-oh.
Oh no.
So today you've accused the Turks of being Greeks. the Greeks being Macedonians, and the Bulgarians being Turks. So
And the
like,
Slavs.
And those are all things I will stand by. You know why? Because I don't have Twitter. So
Yeah.
all right. And on this note, we had a very small portion of the show that I will keep in for the public where we said scandalous stuff. And so we're going to end this here before we actually get in trouble. All right.
Real race hours.
God. Have a nice day.